Hello, this is Dr. Rosenthal again, the founder and director of the Petrarch Institute. Once again, I'm here with my friend and colleague, Miles Smith. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. It's good to see you again, or if you're here for the first time, it is good to see you. We are the Petrarch Institute, and we provide classical education online. Alex, did you want to tell the people briefly what that means?
Sure, and I should say that Dr. Smith is the co-founder. Basically what we do is focus on the classical humanities tradition of education, but using the modern technology of the internet to bring the classics to as wide a broad an audience as possible, to bring these treasures and at affordable prices. If anybody's interested, check out our website. It should be up on the screen, www.petrarch-institute.com. There you will find, if you're interested in the courses, you just have to send me an email, and all the information should be up there.
Excellent. Alex, we, for those who've seen some of our previous podcasts, or for whom this is the first one, have been building a bit of an outline of the case for the relevance, the interest, the value of the classics, and hopefully people are beginning to find their appetites whetted in that way. But of course, part of the motive for what we're doing is that the classics today face some challenges, despite their enduring value and appeal. So do you want to give people an idea of some of the key challenges or obstacles faced by the classics in today's world?
Yeah, I mean, so our idea for this one is we'll just discuss some of the challenges, and then a next podcast we will try to address some of them, and I'll try to be as obviously I'm biased in favor of the classics, but I'll try to give the best case for the critiques. So the first thing to note is, as we discussed, the first thing is what we could call the socio-economic issues which have affected the classics. So I mean, as we discussed, in higher education, certainly since the time of the Renaissance, when the classical education was forcefully revived, up until the 19th and early 20th century, the classics had a kind of hegemony over higher education. So if you look at 19th century curricula and entrance requirements, you know, how did you get into Harvard in the 19th century? Basically, know your Greek composition, know your Latin composition, read Cicero, read Virgil, and when you get there, make sure you know your Xenophon as well. Right? I mean, so it was a deeply immersed, the curriculum as well as the preparation was deeply immersed in this classical tradition. But you know, by the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, people were starting to ask whether this kind of education was really suitable for a modern technological, scientific type of society. And the other thing that's happened, and this is, I think, a very interesting irony, there's been a vast expansion in the number of people going to college, right? So in 1940, according to the Census Bureau, 4.6% of the population had four-year bachelor's degrees. By 2009, 29.5%. So there's this massive expansion of people entering in college, and yet the humanities in general have declined. So Peter Kahn did a study which showed that in the late 1960s, 17.8% of students were humanities majors by 8%. It was 8% by 2007. And what are the things that were really driving it? Well, I think what's happened on the socioeconomic front is that college has come to be seen as the ticket to middle-class life, right? It's a way of employment, right? And so vocational and technical values have become much more dominant than liberal arts values. If your goal in going to college is to get a good job, say in a company or in a government or whatever, you know, the logical thought is knowing about spreadsheets might be a lot more valuable than knowing about Roman poetry, right? And you know, the most popular major in the United States are business-related majors. So colleges have become integrated into a kind of socio-economic fact, right? It's seen as a prerequisite for a job, and that has put a lot of pressure on the liberal arts. And the other thing that I'll talk about a little later is the disappearance of Western civilization requirements and foci from the universities. But there are, in addition, and I think you can raise this as a legitimate question, right? How do the classics help me, right? Why shouldn't I just focus on the technical skills that I'm going to need for employment? It can be a tough world out there searching for a job. Do I want a major that's not going to help me, right? In that practical task. So that's what I think is a very big factor. And when you look at the government as well, listen to President Obama's speeches on education. He talks about being worried about America falling behind, but why is he worried? It's the so-called STEM topics, right? Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right? The topics which are perceived as being the things that help one to succeed practically in the context of a modern economy and modern technologically focused society.
Yeah.
So
well, on the one hand, Alex, that comment is a useful cue for the audience to refer to an earlier podcast in which we talked about the connection between classical education, classical learning, and outstanding human achievement in a number of areas, including those which are now filed under that STEM rubric. In terms of your comment that the classics have found themselves in some ways engulfed in a tide of change on the social or political or economic front, some people will be reminded of the idea that ideas have consequences, and so some of those social changes are also the product of changes on the field of ideas itself. Were there philosophical developments in the past, Alex, that helped create a fertile ground for a challenge to the hegemony, as you called it, of classical education?
Absolutely, yes. And I would say hegemony has today become periphery, very much so, right? Yeah, so, I mean, when you talk about American education, although I think you'll find these trends to some degree throughout the Western world, but, I mean, if you talk about American education, there's no name that has the significance of John Dewey, right? He's sort of thought of as the godfather of the American public school, the contemporary American public school education. And he was affiliated with a school of philosophy, which is considered the distinctive, perhaps the most distinctive American contribution to the history of philosophy, pragmatism, right? And in many ways, he gave articulate voice to many of the trends that we're talking about. I mean, you said ideas have consequences, right? That is pragmatism in a nutshell, one can say. And so what he is partially, he wrote these two essays that I think are quite interesting: The Challenge to Liberal Thought and the Problem of the Liberal Arts College, which dealt with this liberal arts curriculum. There were attempts by figures like Mortimer Adler and Robert Hutchins to sort of create great books programs, right? So they would still be sort of based in the classics, but would include modern texts in this Western canon and so forth. And Dewey was to some degree reacting against this tendency. Now, I think to understand Dewey, there's really three key elements to understand Dewey and his relationship to the liberal arts classical tradition. There are three important elements, right, to understand about his thought. The first is progressivism. The second is instrumentalism. That's his term. And the third is democracy, the centrality of democracy. And again, I think he's really giving articulation to tendencies that are going on within the broader culture. Okay, so progressivism. We'll start with progressivism. So Dewey likes to use a lot of terms like reactionary, antiquarian, medievalism as a pejorative, this sort of thing, right? So his perspective is basically that modern life represents a vast improvement over conditions such as prevailed in the past, right? What he talks about three major revolutions in modernity, right? There is the scientific revolution, the revolution of science, there's the revolution of industry, and there's the revolution of democracy, right? And this has so transformed the modern world. He views these achievements as essentially greater than anything that has come before. He characterizes, for example, the civilizations of antiquity, Greek antiquity, and the Middle Ages as being, relatively speaking, primitive, right? So it's a model of history as going from the primitive to the more advanced, right? These are, he emphasizes, pre-scientific and pre-technological cultures. And so while he said, and their systems of education were adapted to more primitive social conditions, right? So he writes that while Greek educational practices were adapted to their type of culture, right? He says the philosophy was faithful. This philosophy, meaning what he says was the models, patterns, and standards that were laid down in Greece some 2,500 years ago and renewed and put into practice in the best age of feudal medievalism 6 and 7 centuries ago, right? This is how he refers to him. He says this philosophy was faithful to the facts of the social life in which it appeared, right? But in other words, it's something for another time, right? And another thing that he says. Yeah, I mean, so we have this image basically of a society which has moved on, right? Which has become more advanced. Now, the second element that I think is important to talk about is this idea of instrumentalism, right? Which is the essence of the pragmatist idea. So is that worth a moment?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So he says he's talking about the great books movement, right? Basically, right, or the movement to go back to the traditional liberal arts curriculum, and he says the reactionary movement is dangerous, or would be if it made serious headway, because it ignores and in effect denies the principle of experimental inquiry and first-hand observation, that is the lifeblood of the entire advance made in the sciences, an advance so marvelous that the progress and knowledge made in uncounted previous millennium is almost nothing in comparison, right? Right. So what has happened in modernity with the rise of science is greater than anything that has happened before. But the important thing is this emphasis on experiment, right, as the key to innovation, and he also, instrumentalism also puts a premium on the practical, right? On the practical. So he goes through these three revolutions that he talks about, and he talks about one of the aspects of what he sees in the liberal arts tradition is that it tended to privilege, say, intellectual activities. Think of philosophy, right? Purely intellectual activities tended to historically privilege those over practical achievements like technology, right, or these sorts of things. And he says what perhaps is not equally obvious is that the marvelous advance in natural science has come about because of the breaking down of the wall existing in ancient and medieval institutions between higher things of a purely intellectual and spiritual nature and lower things of a practical and material nature, right? So it's this idea that it is by overcoming, right? It is by overcoming the Greco-Roman conceptions of the world that mankind has advanced, right? It's by putting childish things behind, right? Things that may have been good when adapted to that more primitive form of society, right? But that no longer should enjoy that kind of centrality. And the last key point is, for Dewey, one of the major purposes of public education and education in general is social reform, and especially what he sees as what is we could say one of America's great achievements is the breaking down of class structures, right? And he sees this as one of the goals of public school education, for example, and education in general. And so basically, he writes that the distinction that the Greeks and others made, right, the Greeks and later the medievals made between intellectual and spiritual activity, the liberal arts, right, and what they used to call the servile arts, right, arts that serve some function beyond themselves, as opposed to arts that have their own proper excellence, that this was really a reflection of the primitive class structure of the time, right? So he writes, as was proper, a liberal or free education was the education of a free man in the Athenian community. But this was to be placed alongside the fact, totally improper from the standpoint of modern democratic communities, that free citizens were few in number and that their freedom had a large servile class as its substratum. That the class that enjoyed the privileges of freedom and a liberal education was based on precisely those considerations that modern liberation has steadily striven to get rid of. So it's the illiberality, in the contemporary sense that he's talking about it, of liberal education that he thinks is a problem. In other words, he seems to think that somehow there is an inextricable bond between the class structures of the ancient and medieval world and the systems of education that have been inherited, even into the modern era, right? That there is a sort of class stigma that still surrounds the liberal arts tradition, we could say. So those, I think, are Dewey, and remember, Dewey's influence in American education has been completely widespread in every area. So I think his thought is very important in this regard to understand some of what has happened.
Well, and in your outline of some of Dewey's points railing against the divisions and the class components of classical education, a lot of people, I certainly hear it, will be hearing preparatory work for a shift from a philosophical difference with classicism to an ideological or power-based disagreement with classicism, so to speak. Did you want to say briefly a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is a problem that's sort of an issue, we could say, that began to surface in the 1960s and really came to the fore in the late 1980s and since. Which is this critique of what is called Eurocentrism, right? Now, even in Dewey, there's a kind of critique, there's a kind of sense that, in this critique of the class-based systems of they're sort of the class-based systems of the old world, right? And in the new world, we should be creating this new modern progressive society in which these things were abandoned, and therefore many of the educational practices of the past should also be abandoned. But we have, we could say, a much more radical rejection of the European inheritance going on in, let's say, coming especially to the fore in the late 1980s. So you had a New York State Board of Regents task force produced a document called A Curriculum of Inclusion, in which it spoke about an environment of intellectual and educational oppression that has characterized the culture and institutions of the United States and the European American world for centuries, right? And the report writes, European culture is likened to the master of a house ruling over a dinner table, himself firmly established at the head of the table and all other cultures being guests from some distance, down the table from the master, who has invited the others through his beneficence, right? And the European civilization is described in the course of this curriculum, and remember, the study of European culture used to be very central even on the high school level. It is characterized as riven by what it calls national egoism, racism, and other sorts of conquering imperialistic impulses, right? So it's a very and we could say negative characterization, and the idea that the educational system has focused on European achievements in a way which has marginalized other cultures and affected even the self-esteem of students who don't identify with that culture. So, so this was what's happening on the high school level. Then you talk about higher education. You have in 1988, Stanford removes its Western civilization requirement, right, which used to be a 2-semester requirement at Stanford, and you have the famous or infamous, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. That is not anecdotal, right? The National Association of Scholars did a survey of 50 U.S. colleges, and they found that in 1964, all of them had Western civilization requirements. 20 of them had a full semester, a 2-semester course, required course on Western civilization. By 2009 or 2010, when the last report was made, none of them had any required courses on Western civilization. Only 32% had even elective courses, right? So there has been, we could say, an ideological belief that the study that there's let's say something that there are these negative traits of imperialism and so forth which are associated with Western civilization, and that it should not therefore be the focus of study. And of course the classics are implicated to the degree that the classics are sort of the foundation, right, or the first phase of Western civilization, right? I mean, it's very difficult to understand the rest of what happened without understanding the foundations. So, so in that sense, the classics have also come under a certain amount of, we could say, ideologically driven scrutiny. So those are, I would say, the three major categories or issues of challenges for the classics to address.
Well, Alex, I think Aristotle would call that a whole mess of stuff to chew on. So that's a good start for our audience on the situation of the classics in the modern environment of economics, society, ideas, and ideology. You mentioned at the outset of the podcast our offerings, which include the course on virtues coming up in the fall. I would just mention that they can also join the discussion and contribute ideas on Twitter, where we can be found as Petrarch Centre, where Centre is spelled the UK Commonwealth way, C-E-N-T-R-E.
Yeah, and the other thing would be the Petrarch Humanities Association on LinkedIn. If anybody is interested in joining, just send a membership request to me on LinkedIn, and we have a lot of interesting discussions there. So.
Absolutely, that's a place where a lot of the ideas that you see developed here in the podcast get hatched. So that's a great place for people who want to listen, think, and contribute.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope it was at least somewhat informative, and I hope you will stay tuned for part 2, where I will try to address, or we will try to address, some of the objections that we've discussed today.
See all of you then.
Take care.